Selkirk, Montana, October 13th, 1899. The morning sun broke over the Bitterroot Mountains like any other autumn day, casting long golden shadows across quiet porches and frost-laced rooftops. But inside the Thornfield mansion on Maple Street, time had stopped. Every bed was perfectly made, every gown untouched, and not a single whisper of movement stirred within. 7 sisters, the daughters of wealthy merchant Gabriel Thornfield, had seemingly vanished in the night. Margaret, Catherine, the twins Eleanor and Elizabeth, Sarah, Grace, and little Rebecca. Each room still bore the warmth of its occupant, yet all were empty. No signs of escape or struggle. No footprints disturbed the frosted earth outside. Their nightgowns hung in their usual places. Personal items remained undisturbed. It was as if the young women had simply evaporated. Local authorities were baffled. No windows had been breached. Doors remained bolted from within. There was no evidence of theft or intrusion. Only the unsettling neatness of a house too quiet for its size. What puzzled Sheriff William Harding most was the state of each bedroom. Drawers opened and then closed, books shifted slightly, vanity brushes out of place. Someone had been there. Someone who knew their way around, but not quite well enough to restore everything to its exact order. Word spread like wildfire across Selkirk. This wasn't the kind of town that forgot its daughters. These young women were more than names. They were teachers, artists, musicians, businesswomen, community leaders. And now, they were simply gone. The Thornfield case would become more than a local tragedy. It would spiral into something darker, a mystery tied to underground networks, hidden records, and unimaginable betrayal. A sealed federal report, hidden for decades, would later suggest that what happened that night wasn't a random event, but part of something far more sinister. This is the beginning of a story buried for more than a century. A tale not just of disappearance, but of corruption, exploitation, and how even the most promising lives can vanish when the wrong hands are pulling the strings. Selkirk would never be the same. And as we journey deeper into the events of that cold October night, one truth will become undeniable. Someone had planned this. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. In 1899, Selkirk stood as a shimmering promise of the American frontier dream. Tucked deep within Montana's rugged terrain, the town had grown rapidly from a cluster of miners' tents into a bustling hub of commerce and opportunity. The newly completed Northern Pacific Railroad had transformed it, drawing investors, tradesmen, and families from as far as New York and Chicago. With silver flowing steadily from the surrounding hills, Selkirk had become a magnet for those hungry for fortune, and a perfect place to disappear in plain sight. Gabriel Thornfield arrived during the harsh winter of 1892 with a wagon full of dry goods, 7 daughters bundled in blankets, and no wife. She had succumbed to pneumonia somewhere in the snowy plains of Ohio. What followed was nothing short of miraculous. In just a few years, Gabriel turned a modest supply cart into the most successful general store for miles. His business flourished, eventually allowing him to construct a grand Victorian mansion that towered over the town like a palace. The Thornfield girls were admired by all. Margaret, the eldest, taught at the local schoolhouse, shaping young minds with wisdom beyond her years. Catherine brought color to Selkirk with her breathtaking landscapes and portraits. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, ran a thriving seamstress shop. Sarah directed the church choir and organized charity events. Grace kept her father's financial boots. Kies, impressing businessmen with her numerical prowess. And young Rebecca, only 14, read to children at the library and greeted everyone with a light in her eyes that seemed impossible to dim. They were a family that symbolized progress, hardworking, educated, deeply rooted in the community. But beneath that polished surface, unease had begun to creep in. People had started to whisper. How had Gabriel, a newcomer with no known connections, secured exclusive contracts with mining companies? Why did he host late-night meetings with men who arrived unannounced and left before sunrise? Who were these strangers in finely tailored suits who seemed to know everyone and yet speak to no one? It wasn't just curiosity. It was tension, and it grew heavier with each passing week. Selkirk was a town used to secrets, but this one felt different. Too big, too quiet, and too close to home. October 12th, 1899. It began like any other Thursday, wrapped in the crisp embrace of a Montana autumn. The maple leaves on Main Street glowed in reds and golds, their colors sharpened by the clear morning air. But for those who looked closely, something about the day felt slightly off. Gabriel Thornfield opened his store as he always did, precisely at 7 a.m. Customers came and went, but many noticed how distracted he seemed. He checked his pocket watch far more than usual, his usual charm replaced with anxious glances toward the windows. Margaret left for the schoolhouse, leather satchel in hand. Parents waiting outside noted how subdued she looked, her greetings polite but hurried. Her usually perfect hair had been hastily pinned, and a small ink smudge marked the hem of her skirt, a rare imperfection for someone so precise. Catherine set up her easel in the backyard, attempting to finish a painting she'd been working on for weeks. But neighbors observed her pacing between brushstrokes, her eyes frequently drifting toward the train station. The painting itself, once alive with mountain light, remained unfinished, a single patch reworked endlessly as if she were trying to scrub awe by a thought. At the seamstress shop, Eleanor and Elizabeth stitched in silence. Customers came in for fittings, but the cheerful chatter usually bubbling between the sisters was gone. Their voices dropped to whispers when the door closed, and more than once they were caught measuring the same fabric twice. Sarah spent the morning at the church, practicing hymns for the Sunday service. Reverend Atwood noticed her faltering pitch, her uncertain hands at the organ. When he asked if she was unwell, she merely smiled and shook her head, eyes drifting toward the chapel doors. In the store, Grace miscounted change, not once but 3 times. Her numbers, once her pride, betrayed her as her mind wandered. Even Rebecca, bright and bubbly, seemed subdued while helping the housekeeper. She asked questions about travel, loneliness, and whether people could ever feel safe far from home. By mid-afternoon, every Thornfield sister had broken their routine in some small, strange way. To the untrained eye, nothing looked amiss. But for those who had known the family for years, the day felt like the closing note of a long, familiar song played just slightly out of tune. At around 3:00 p.m., just as the autumn light began its golden descent over Selkirk, Dr. Samuel Porter was making his way back from a house call on the outskirts of town. His buggy rattled quietly down River Street when something unusual caught his eye. All 7 Thornfield sisters walking together in the same direction, toward the train station. It stopped him cold. This was not a family known for spontaneous outings. Each sister kept to a rigid schedule, a rhythm so consistent that the townsfolk could set their clocks by them. Seeing them together, at that hour, on that road, was unsettling. But it wasn't just their presence. It was their manner. They walked in silence. No laughter, no chatter, no glances exchanged between them. Their faces were pale, set with an eerie determination. They moved not like seven sisters enjoying a stroll, but like mourners heading to an unseen funeral. Their footsteps, aligned and measured, looked rehearsed, like a procession. Dr. Porter called out a friendly greeting. Only one of them, Rebecca, turned her head, and what he saw in her face would haunt him for years. Her expression was frozen with fear, not the kind that passes in a moment, but a deep-rooted terror that hollows out the soul. Her eyes met his for only an instant, but in them he saw something desperate, something pleading. It wasn't just fear, it was a silent scream. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then quickly turned away and rejoined the line. The other sisters never looked back. By nightfall, only a handful of people would realize this was the last time the Thornfield sisters were seen alive by someone outside their home. Later that evening, Timothy Fletcher, the young telegraph clerk, glanced out from his post just past 9 p.m. The amber light from the street lamp illuminated a chilling scene. The seven sisters standing together once again, side by side, facing the train station. They were dressed in their best. Lace collars, pinned hair, polished shoes, as though preparing for a formal event. But the dread etched on their faces told a different story. 10 minutes later, they were gone, and Selkirk would never see them again. At dawn on October 13th, the Thornfield mansion stood serene beneath a cloudless sky. Frost clung to its ornate windows, untouched and glistening, betraying no trace of movement. Mrs. Caldwell, the family's long-serving housekeeper, arrived as she did every morning to prepare breakfast. She expected to hear laughter, clinking china, the shuffle of slippers on the stairs. Instead, she stepped into a tomb. The front door, locked from within the night before, opened smoothly. Nothing inside the grand home was out of place, but something was wrong, a silence too deep to be peaceful. She called out softly. No reply. She listened. No footfalls, no voices, not even the creak of old wood. In the kitchen, the kettle sat cold, the table untouched, no teacups, no crumbs, none of the usual signs of a bustling morning. The sisters' evening ritual, tea, planning, laughter, had simply not happened. It was as if the house had skipped a heartbeat. Uneasy, Mrs. Caldwell made her way upstairs. Margaret's door was closed. A light knock went unanswered. Slowly, she turned the knob and stepped inside, and her breath caught. The bed was perfectly made, its corners tucked with military precision. Her nightgown hung exactly where it had been placed. Books, lesson plans, a hairbrush, everything in its usual place, yet everything felt wrong. The desk drawers were slightly out of order. The papers had been touched. The room held the shape of its owner, but none of her presence. Room by room, the story repeated. Catherine's artistic chaos had been replaced with a forced neatness. Paints were capped, canvases stacked, brushes scrubbed clean. It was meticulous, and completely unlike her. The twins' room bore telltale signs of intrusion. Drawers opened and shut, items returned to the wrong spots. Their perfect symmetry had been imitated, but not faithfully. Sarah's hymnals were stacked too neatly. Grace's ledgers bore creased pages. Rebecca's dolls sat just slightly out of alignment, as if someone had tried to reset a scene they didn't fully understand. By the time Mrs. Caldwell reached the final room, dread overwhelmed her. The house hadn't just been abandoned. It had been carefully, almost surgically, searched. But nothing was stolen. 7 sisters, gone without a trace. 7 rooms disturbed but intact. The House of Perfect Silence had become Selkirk's loudest mystery. Gabriel Thornfield was still in his bed when the screams began echoing down Maple Street. He awoke to chaos, neighbors rushing up his porch, Mrs. Caldwell sobbing in the yard, the sound of panic crashing against the morning calm. Within minutes, he was dressed and rushing from room to room, calling each daughter's name, his voice growing hoarser with every unanswered plea. But it wasn't just silence that greeted him. It was the impossibility of it all. Every room appeared untouched, and yet felt utterly violated. The house was locked from the inside, windows latched, doors bolted. The girls' belongings, their jewelry, keepsakes, even the modest cash they kept, were all there. Nothing had been taken, and still, everything was wrong. Too still, too perfect, too quiet. Sheriff William Harding arrived shortly thereafter, summoned by a neighbor who had seen the crowd forming. He had handled his share of cattle thefts, bar fights, and domestic disputes. But this was something altogether different. Harding began with the basics. He examined the entrances. No forced locks, no broken panes. The frost outside was pristine. No boot prints, no wagon tracks, no scuffs in the soil. It was as though no one had left, and no one had entered. He checked the windows, basement, and attic. Nothing. Then he moved to the bedrooms. Each space whispered of intrusion, but not robbery. Personal items had been examined and returned with surgical precision. Dresses unfolded and refolded, diaries opened and closed, trinkets moved half an inch from their original places. Harding could sense it immediately. Someone had searched these rooms, carefully, methodically, and tried to erase their presence, but they hadn't done it perfectly. He began speaking with neighbors. One by one, strange details emerged. People recalled unfamiliar men in expensive coats arriving on the evening train, speaking to no one and leaving before dawn. No handshakes, no smiles, no reason to be in town at all. And then there were the messages. Timothy Fletcher from the telegraph office mentioned a recent spike in coded telegrams, long strings of numbers and letters sent to cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. Most had been sent late at night, many by Gabriel Thornfield himself. As Harding looked over the notes in his ledger, a realization began to dawn. This wasn't an isolated event. This was a carefully orchestrated operation, and it had started long before anyone noticed. As the sun set on Selkirk that October day, the town buzzed with rumors, but none dared say aloud what they feared most: that the Thornfield sisters hadn't run away, and this wasn't a case of miscommunication or rebellion. It was something colder, something planned. Sheriff Harding dug deeper. He interviewed staff from the telegraph office and railroad station, piecing together a timeline of visitors and messages that didn't make sense. At least not if Selkirk was just a quiet mining town. The same names and initials kept surfacing in passenger logs and encrypted dispatches. They weren't residents. They weren't family. They were men who appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. Then Harding visited the town's bank. At first, Charles Whitman, the president, was defensive. He resisted opening the Thornfield accounts, but Harding, determined and now backed by federal interest, insisted. The records painted a story no one had expected, or perhaps some had always suspected. In the last 6 months alone, Gabriel Thornfield had withdrawn large sums of gold, not checks, not wire transfers, gold coins, quiet, untraceable. These withdrawals aligned precisely with the arrival and departure of those well-dressed strangers. The deposits coming into Gabriel's account were even more curious. Consistent payments from Eastern banks under obscure company names. They didn't match any known suppliers or business clients. Whitman admitted, under pressure, that several prominent townsmen, including the mayor, had received similar payments. The town's prosperity hadn't been built solely on mining and merchant trade. There were outside interests funding Selkirk's rise, interests no one could quite identify. Harding's gut turned. Something was very wrong. Meanwhile, the community's grief began to fracture into blame. Whispers floated between pews at church and over fence posts in backyards. Some suspected Gabriel, others suggested the sisters had discovered something forbidden and paid the price. But most were simply afraid to ask questions. Too much had changed too fast in Selkirk, and now 7 young women had vanished without a trace. Harding stood on the steps of the Thornfield mansion that night, staring up at its silent windows, feeling the weight of a truth just beyond his grasp. This wasn't just a family tragedy. This was the tip of something vast, hidden, and engineered with terrifying precision. Gabriel Thornfield had always been a figure of admiration in Selkirk, a widowed father who raised 7 accomplished daughters while building a business empire from nothing. He embodied the frail, on-tier dream. But now, under the magnifying glass of an unfolding investigation, the man once revered as a community cornerstone began to look more like a puzzle with missing pieces. Federal investigators arrived in early November. Leading them was Inspector Marcus Reed from the Department of Justice, a sharp, methodical man known for exposing criminal enterprises hiding behind legitimate fronts. Reed wasn't interested in sentimental explanations or theories about runaways. He was after proof, paper trails, connections, and Gabriel, it turned out, had plenty of both. Reed started with the Thornfield ledgers. What he found wasn't bookkeeping, it was orchestration. Dozens of transactions linked to shell companies, repeated payments from a mysterious entity called the Rocky Mountain Development Company. No goods exchanged, no inventory moved, just funds, large, consistent, and increasing in the months before the sisters disappeared. Selkirk's mining families had whispered about this company before. It had supposedly bought up land, funded businesses, and operated far beyond the legal visibility of the frontier's limited institutions. But no one had ever proven it existed. Until now. Further digging revealed something far worse. Gabriel had been in contact with the company for years, since shortly after arriving in Selkirk. Letters, contracts, and coded messages linked him directly to what appeared to be a far-reaching network of criminal influence, land deals, mining rights, political appointments, all lubricated with discreet payments and silent cooperation. The most chilling discovery came from the telegraph office. Gabriel had personally dispatched dozens of coded telegrams to major cities, each message aligning with financial transfers and, Reed suspected, with the movements of trafficked individuals, young women, some of them possibly his own daughters. The narrative began to shift. Gabriel was no longer just the grieving father, he was a collaborator, perhaps even a broker, working with powerful men to feed a system that preyed on the isolated and the vulnerable. Had he been a victim of blackmail, a man too deep to escape, or had ambition blinded him to the true cost of the fortune he'd built? Selkirk had always looked up to Gabriel Thornfield. Now it looked at him in horror. As Inspector Reed followed the money, the investigation expanded well beyond the Montana border. What began as a missing persons case now unraveled like a tapestry woven across half the continent, one thread leading to another, pulling tighter with each discovery. At the heart of it all was the Rocky Mountain Development Company, a name that existed only in whispers and unsigned contracts, but whose fingerprints were everywhere. The company's method was elegant in its cruelty. Fund a local merchant or landowner, elevate their status, then demand favors in return. At first, those favors were small. Introductions, endorsements, the soft sway of influence. But in time, the demands escalated. Information, connections, access, and eventually, people. Reed uncovered letters written in Gabriel's hand, stored in the family's attic. Faded ink on expensive paper, polite language masking an undercurrent of desperation. He had initially offered details about the town, which families struggled, which daughters might seek opportunities elsewhere. But as the years passed, the tone darkened. There were pleas, evasions, bargaining, and finally, acceptance. In one letter dated just 2 weeks before the disappearance, Gabriel wrote, "I have no other asset left to offer you. Take what you came for. Just let them live." It was damning. Reed tracked similar patterns in neighboring states. Girls gone missing under similar circumstances. No violence, no ransom, just families left with quested ions that dissolved over time. In many cases, fathers had received sudden windfalls, debts erased, loans forgiven. And then, silence. In Selkirk, the town divided. Some rallied around Gabriel, insisting he'd been forced into an impossible corner. Others saw betrayal, unforgivable and deliberate. But no one doubted anymore that something monstrous had unfolded in their midst, and that it had been building for years beneath the surface. As winter crept into the valleys and snow dusted the streets, federal agents worked from the town's courthouse, converting it into an impromptu operations center. Files mounted, names surfaced, and the sense of dread in Selkirk thickened. This wasn't just about 7 sisters. This was about an entire system, hidden in plain sight, powered by silence and greed, stretching eastward like a shadow that refused to lift. And Reed was determined to follow it to its end. In the spring of 1922, nearly 23 years after the Thornfield sisters vanished, a demolition crew working on Chicago's South Side uncovered something no one expected. A sealed room hidden behind the false wall of an abandoned warehouse. The air inside was stale and heavy, thick with dust and history. But what lay within would reignite the investigation and shatter any lingering illusions of innocence. Dozens of filing cabinets, locked boxes, and trunks filled the chamber. Their contents were chilling: personal files, photographs, correspondence, all meticulously catalogued, and among them 7 small portraits, unmistakable in their clarity, of the Thornfield sisters. The images were formal, almost clinical. Each woman posed carefully, wearing clothing that reflected wealth, but eyes that betrayed something else: weariness, loss, fear, and most disturbingly, age. These weren't teenage girls caught in their final days in Selkirk. These were grown women, photographed years after their supposed disappearance. Margaret appeared older, composed, but burdened. Catherine's elegance had survived, but so had the sorrow behind her eyes. The twins were shown separately, a calculated cruelty that mirrored what would soon be confirmed. They had been deliberately separated. Sarah, once joyful, looked faded and restrained. Grace's once bright intellect seemed dimmed by exhaustion, and Rebecca, the youngest, was barely recognizable. Dressed finely, yes, but the light in her face was gone. Each photograph came with a dossier, detailed notes about the sisters' personalities, skills, and backgrounds, as though they were inventory. Reed's team now had hard proof. The Thornfield sisters had been captured, cataloged and sold into a network that operated under the guise of opportunity and advancement. Detective John Sullivan of the Chicago Police Department took the lead on what became known as the Selkirk File. His unit pieced together a broader operation that had flourished behind respectable facades: domestic placement agencies, matrimonial services, religious charities, all perfect masks. The warehouse's files revealed hundreds of names: girls from Nevada, Colorado, Utah, most from small, isolated communities. The patterns matched, the methods repeated. And Selkirk, it seemed, had been just one piece of a sprawling, decades-long human trafficking empire. The discovery was devastating, but it was also the break Reed had been waiting for. What had happened to the Thornfield sisters was no longer a mystery. It was a conspiracy. And now, the hunt for answers would become a hunt for justice. With the files from the Chicago warehouse in federal hands, the veil that had obscured the fate of the Thornfield sisters began to lift. Slowly, painfully. What emerged was not a single act of betrayal, but an entire structure of systemic exploitation, forged from ambition, desperation, and deception. What? Gabriel Thornfield, once considered a symbol of frontier success, had not simply stumbled into the clutches of a criminal syndicate. He had joined them, piece by piece, year by year, until the price of his prosperity became his daughters. Letters recovered from the warehouse included private correspondence between Gabriel and his Eastern handlers. Early notes were simple: names of families, suggestions of opportunity. Then, over time, came detailed reports: health conditions, education levels, marriage potential. He wrote about his own girls in the language of trade, but not without resistance. The most recent letters showed a man unraveling: pleas to renegotiate, attempts to offer gold, land, influence. But the responses were chillingly cold. One telegram, decoded by federal agents, read, "Payment overdue. Deliver per agreement or consequences extend beyond family." Gabriel's final entries were filled with guilt and fatalism. He wrote of watching his daughters at dinner, knowing it would be the last time. He described Sarah's voice during evening hymns, the way Catherine's paintbrush paused mid-stroke, Rebecca's questions about distant places. He had become a spectator in a horror of his own making. In his journal, one phrase appeared repeatedly: they promised no harm would come to them. That promise had been a lie. Federal agents, working with Sullivan in Chicago and Reed in Montana, began piecing together what happened next. The sisters were each relocated to separate cities, each placed in an arrangement, called a match in the documents, with a wealthy patron who had paid handsomely for a wife with specific traits. One wanted a teacher, another an artist, another a bookkeeper. The youngest, she was marked hold until eligible. There were contracts, photographs, assignments. The Thornfield sisters had not been kidnapped. They had been sold, and their fates, while varied, bore the same mark: stripped of identity, scattered across the country, forced into lives that looked respectable on paper, but were prisons in practice. By summer 1922, federal investigators had located 3 of the surviving Thornfield sisters. Their lives, though carefully constructed and outwardly respectable, bore the silent scars of captivity, loss, and erasure. Each woman had lived under an assumed name for over 2 decades, their true identities buried beneath years of enforced obedience and psychological warfare. Margaret, now known as Mary Patterson, lived in Cleveland, Ohio. She was the wife of Harrison Pembroke, a steel magnate who had specifically requested a woman with intelligence and educational experience. To outsiders, they were a polished couple with 3 children and a well-appointed home. But inside that home, Margaret had been a prisoner, forbidden from speaking of her past, surveilled by house staff loyal to her husband, and emotionally isolated. She had endured 23 years of controlled silence. But Margaret had never surrendered her mind. In secret, she kept journals, pages hidden in attic beams and beneath floorboards, recording everything. The lies, the punishments, the names. She documented the network's inner workings in meticulous detail, believing that one day someone would come asking for the truth. Catherine, renamed Caroline Phillips, was found in Milwaukee. She had been given to Augustus Richardson, an art dealer who saw her talent not as a gift, but as a commodity. He forced her to paint under his name, selling her work at galleries while keeping her confined to a studio she rarely left. Catherine's art remained her only escape, her brushstrokes softening her grief, hiding messages in shadows and shapes. Her paintings, though beautiful, bore a haunting quality that collectors admired but could not explain. The twins had been deliberately split, a calculated act by the traffickers to break their bond. Eleanor was sent to St. Louis, married to Marcus Whitfield, a rising businessman who wanted a refined wife with social skills. The separation shattered her. Within months, she suffered a psychological collapse and was institutionalized, her past erased by doctors who never knew her real name. Elizabeth, placed in Chicago as Ellen Pierce, had married a banker who valued her efficiency and silence. She lived under strict control, told her sister had died, and endured years of emotional manipulation. Though she survived, the trauma never left her eyes. Their fates were not unique. Dozens of files from the warehouse showed women across the West trapped in similar arrangements. Each sister had been chosen for what she could provide. None had been seen as human. Among all the sisters, Rebecca's fate was the most tragic. Only 14 when she vanished from Selkirk, Rebecca had not been assigned a placement like her older sisters. The files recovered from the Chicago warehouse listed her under a different designation. Not yet market ready. Hold for grooming. She was shuffled between boarding homes operated by the trafficking network, facilities dressed up as schools, orphanages, or moral rehabilitation centers. But in truth, they were holding pens. Isolated, obedient, re-educated. That was the goal. For 5 years, Rebecca was moved from state to state. Kansas, Indiana, Ohio, never staying long, never making friends. Her handlers ensured she remained invisible to authorities and incapable of escape. As she grew older, internal reports noted that her demeanor had changed. The bright, curious child remembered by Selkirk had become withdrawn and thin, her health failing. She was never placed. By the time she turned 19, tuberculosis had taken hold, a common affliction in the overcrowded, unsanitary facilities the network operated. A report from 1907 noted her death with bureaucratic indifference. Expired, lung failure, no further action needed. There was no burial record, no obituary, just a line in a ledger and a life erased. When investigators found her file, they were stunned by how complete it was. Documents tracking everything from her dietary habits to psychological evaluations written by handlers with no medical background. It was the closest thing to a scientific dissection of a spirit slowly broken. Her sisters never knew what had happened to her. Margaret, when told during a federal debriefing, wept silently for a full hour before asking to see the place where her youngest sister had died. She was denied. The building had long since been repurposed. A factory now stood in its place. Rebecca had died with no one calling her name, no one remembering the girl who once lit up Selkirk's library with her laughter. She never saw her home again, never escaped the walls they built around her. Of all the sisters, Rebecca had no chance to resist, no time to find small victories. Her only legacy was the paper trail she unknowingly left behind, the final proof of just how far the network's reach had extended. The revelations surrounding the Thornfield sisters shattered the nation's illusions about the safety of its frontier communities. In late 1922, the U.S. government launched a sweeping operation. Coordinated raids in 12 states, over 200 agents deployed, and dozens of facilities linked to the trafficking network shut down within weeks. They called it Operation Morning Bell. At its center stood Marcus Peaton, the elusive architect of the entire system. He had built the trafficking empire under the guise of economic development, using front companies like the Rocky Mountain Development Company to mask the movement of both money and people. When arrested at his mansion in Chicago, he offered no resistance. In court, he referred to himself as a facilitator of opportunity. He showed no remorse. "I merely connected supply with demand," Peaton said during testimony. The families agreed. The girls were wanted. The nation recoiled. 17 of his key associates were convicted of crimes ranging from conspiracy and abduction to corruption and human trafficking. The trials revealed just how far the rot had spread. Judges, sheriffs, bankers, and mayors who had accepted bribes or looked away. Selkirk's own leaders were among them. The mayor, the bank president, and 2 business owners had received payments to suppress investigations and silence suspicions for years. Even Gabriel Thornfield's legacy took a darker turn. After his daughters vanished, Gabriel lived as a ghost in his own home. He never remarried, rarely spoke. He visited the town cemetery weekly, placing flowers at 7 marble headstones that held no bodies, only dates. But those dates, it turned out, weren't memorials. They were records, the exact dates his daughters had been delivered to the network's agents. Gabriel had known where they went. He had watched the system claim them. Perhaps, in his mind, he thought he was saving them from something worse. He died in Denver in 1918, a suicide. In his final letter, never mailed but found in a locked drawer, he wrote, "I tried to buy time. I sold my soul instead." 3 of the surviving sisters, Margaret, Catherine, and Elizabeth, were offered the chance to testify publicly. Only Margaret stepped forward. Her voice in court, clear and resolute, marked a turning point in American history. She gave names, dates, places. She didn't tremble. She didn't break. But she never smiled again. Selkirk did not survive the truth. Once the pride of Montana's frontier, the town slowly crumbled beneath the weight of its guilt. The general store was sold and renamed. The mansion on Maple Street, long abandoned, was razed in 1925. In its place, nothing was built, just a patch of grass, too clean, too quiet, as if the town had decided that forgetting was easier than remembering. Residents moved away, unable to bear the stares from strangers or the weight of what had once been left unsaid. New families arrived, ignorant of the town's past, uninterested in the whispers. Selkirk transformed from a community into a collection of individuals, polite, detached, careful not to ask too many questions. But the cemetery remained. The 7 marble headstones Gabriel once erected were replaced with a single monument, a granite slab, simple and solemn, engraved with the words, "To the 7 sisters, victims of ambition and silence, may truth keep you where justice failed." The monument was paid for not by the state, but by private donations. People from across the country who had read the story in newspapers, seen Margaret's testimony, and felt the icy grip of something they could not unsee. The Thornfield case changed more than Selkirk. It reshaped federal policy. New laws were passed, mandating transparency for employment and matrimonial agencies. A centralized missing persons registry was formed. Railway companies were ordered to document female passengers traveling alone. Social reformers pushed for protections that had not existed during the sisters' time. But even those changes couldn't erase what had happened. The case exposed an American truth no one wanted to admit, that under the banner of opportunity, entire systems had grown to exploit the desperate and the isolated, that innocence could be priced, that progress, when built on silence, leaves ruin in its wake. Margaret spent the rest of her life in advocacy, fighting to expose similar crimes. She never remarried, never left Cleveland. She died in 1941, her journals preserved in the Library of Congress, the same pages she once hid beneath attic beams. Catherine and Elizabeth lived quietly under their assumed names, raising children who never learned the truth. As for Rebecca, Eleanor, Sarah, and Grace, their stories end too soon, stolen before they could begin. The Thornfield sisters never returned home, but their story refuses to stay buried.